Order. Hearing is now resumed.
Thank you, doctors. I have only about 12 minutes left with you, and so I'm going to focus the remainder of my questions primarily on a second component of the Commissioner's work here and our work here, which is to look towards recommendations on how we can more collaboratively work together for the long-term sustainability of Fraser River sockeye salmon. And so that's my goal of in dialogue with you in the next 10 minutes. It's only a short time, but we'll see what we can do. I'm going to go first to your CV, which is Exhibit 1510, Dr. Miller. And I know that you're the leading expert in cutting-edge research. You have a $5.3 million budget from 2008 to 2012 on genomic tools for fisheries management, including the development of biomarkers associated with health. And in particular, one of the places you heard us get to in the earlier panel was how we can spend a lot of time talking about pathogens, but as an important component of that is to talk about health and the health, the biomarkers of health. So I'm wondering if you would agree with me that in your work going forward and using this cutting edge research, it would be very useful to work closely with First Nations who have a keen awareness of in situ identification of biomarkers of health. They know how to look at the fish, they know what signs the fish are seeing, they see changes in that fish, sometimes very subtle and sometimes very much at the population level. Do you agree with me that that type of in situ eyes is extremely helpful when developing priorities for the type of research you're looking at for biomarkers on health?
I absolutely agree. My lab has worked with First Nations quite extensively in our genetic stock identification program, making sure that we have baselines that include enough samples from stocks of interest to First Nations. And we have also processed mixed stock samples for First Nations. In terms of health, I think it's not very clear here, but my program is not all about disease, and we look at other aspects. I mean, genomics can look at a wide variety of different physiological factors. Other kinds of things that we saw that differentiated 2007 and 2008 fish were indications of immunosuppression, indications of reduced oxygen availability, hypoxia, which we're interested in whether that could come from the exposure to harmful algal blooms, which we were able to amplify off of some of their gills. They appeared to have a higher metabolic rate, and there was some indication that there may have had reduced feeding and growth. It is very important to our genomics program that we have other information about fish as well that doesn't necessarily just pertain to genomics. And I can't stress that enough, that having people in the field who are seeing these fish and seeing indications of, pale gills or other sorts of things externally on this fish are very, very important, and I absolutely welcome the involvement of First Nations information in that.
And having worked with First Nations, you'll appreciate that there has been a history of distrust that has occurred between First Nations and Department of Fisheries and Oceans. Would you agree that it would be useful to have direct and iterative engagement between DFO science researchers and First Nations for the transparent exchange of information?
I believe that already exists with our stock ID program. This is a fairly so my answer is yes. I do believe that would be a positive move forward. I think that my lab in particular has already had some success in that regard.
I'm going to come to you in a second, Dr. Garber. I'm not leaving you out. I'll just go one step further. Would you also agree that an oversight committee in which the federal government, the provincial government, First Nations, stakeholders, environmental groups were all charged with reviewing DFO's scientific research agendas, setting priorities, working with the experts, reviewing results would be a useful way of exchanging information in a timely way and ensuring a balanced approach to research?
I certainly wouldn't stand against that, no.
Dr. Garber, would you do you accept both of those recommendations, and would you support those?
Yes, I would, and I can comment as well as our program, at least the virology program, is quite involved in multiple fish health projects with the First Nations. In particular, my research group is working on a project right now with the Okanagan First Nation Alliance, looking and assessing disease in enhancing the Okanagan River sockeye stock. So we already do at least in my program, we do have a exchange where the scientists are collaborating and interacting with the First Nations directly.
And that's helpful.
Yeah, it's very helpful.
Thank you. And I want to go one step further because there's a concern that I have been developing about which came up with this potential new virus. As I understand it, Dr. Christie, you started your research in 2008. The analysis was completed by 2009 that this could be a virus. And here we are in 2011, and in fact, just days before you're coming to give evidence, and you're now getting access to see, you're getting a commitment to access to fish at the net pen farms. Would you agree with me that it would also be extremely useful and helpful for a timely protocol of exchange of information with the farms on a regular basis, not waiting for political interplay, not waiting for anything else, but that we have a protocol in place between the Department of Fisheries and Oceans that allows you to get at those fish as soon as you need to in order to ensure timely research?
I mean, yes, I would agree that that would be helpful. I mean, I guess I had not known what the protocol was in terms of approaching the industry.
And so if you had a protocol in place and the industry had agreed to it, and the Department of Fisheries had agreed to it, and First Nations had agreed to it, that would be extremely useful for you, wouldn't it?
Yes, it would.
Thank you. Could I just now go to Exhibit 1517? And this is just a question about all the things that you've been doing, Dr. Miller, to get your information out. I don't see in the material I was able to review, and I can appreciate there may be way more material than we were able to review out there, that in your next steps and in your review of things, you'd make an effort to make sure that your information, which is cutting edge, is getting directly to First Nations. Is that because you don't see that as your job, or what is it? Why is it that in all of the work that you're doing, we don't have, I think we need to talk to First Nations directly on this?
I think given that there was this commission ongoing, and you know, I don't know what my directive would have been within DFO about what groups to talk to this about. Obviously, I hadn't approached the aquaculture industry. I hadn't approached First Nations. I did seek some direction on that. There certainly would have been some members of First Nations aware of this work who are involved in the Fraser panel at the Pacific Salmon Commission, because they funded some of this research, and I have talked to them about this, although not since we've identified this virus. So there would have been some information through that route. We also had a portion of our Genome BC which targeted doing some social sciences and kind of learning how to work well with managers, with First Nations, with stakeholders, and we did do a little bit of dialogue with First Nations within that program. That wasn't me directly, but so the intent was absolutely to engage various groups, and absolutely including First Nations.
We just haven't been able to get to that because of this commission?
No, there's a social scientist who was working with me at University of British Columbia, and he did engage a variety of First Nations in his work.
Okay, I'm running out of time. I'm confident of that. I want to just ask two quick questions on this exhibit. If you could go to EE on page 10 of this, and this is the one that actually, as I read it, is your most recent one, even though the date at the top of it was incorrect. So this is, as
yes, I'm sorry about that.
That's okay. And you've got the moving forward there. But you mentioned uncertainties for funding in that paragraph, and I'm just wondering, have those uncertainties for funding been clarified now? Is the program in severe jeopardy? What's happening here?
We have no funding to work on sockeye salmon at the present time, but that part of the reason for that within the department is that the major funding that I have used from the department for working on genomics is the Genomics Research and Development Initiative funding, and that has not been approved by Treasury Board yet. And so we all have proposals into that, but there's no money in the bank essentially at this time. So at the time, right now, I actually have no departmental money or outside money to work on sockeye salmon from the Fraser River.
Extraordinarily sad, Dr. Miller, and hopefully we'll be able to persevere and see how we can go forward in those circumstances. At the bottom of page 8, an exhibit, in the same exhibit, if you go to W, this may just be a correction, but that we need to, oh, hold on. I have the, as a quote that, go to W. Oh, there it is, in your title. Analysis of 2008 smolt contrast studies revealed the physiological divergence between the years starts in the freshwater environment. And I just wanted to make sure, is it true that things will start in the freshwater environment? Do we know that? We actually don't know where things are starting, do we?
One can contrast the physiology of the fish in various years, and this question was, are there physiological divergences that we see among fish from those two different years? Are those restricted to the marine environment, where we know that they had a very challenging, or at least my colleagues suggest that there was a very challenging marine environment in 2007, and a very good marine environment coast-wide for all salmon species in 2008. So the question was, do we see from the genomics perspective a physiological divergence that is exclusive to the marine environment, so that the fish come out of the freshwater in the same in very similar condition, and do we see divergence that's exclusive to the marine environment? And what we found in 2 of the 3 tissues that we looked at was that we saw strong physiological divergence between those fish before they left freshwater, as well as in the marine environment. And so we are still analyzing these data. We've done a lot of analysis on what differentiates fish in the marine environment, and we're now just starting to look at what are the factors that are differentiating fish in the freshwater environment. Why do we have fish coming out in such different condition from freshwater? One of the differences was that fish in 2007 had a much stronger and MRS signature than they did in 2008. Although the MRS was there in 2008, more of the fish were affected before they left freshwater in 2007 in multiple tissues. But I do not believe that is the only thing, and we're still analyzing that data. So the point,
we don't have enough information right now to know where it starts. We know it's active in freshwater, and we know it's active in the marine, but we don't know where it starts.
Physiology will tell you where, by doing genomics, and obviously this has to be done over multiple years, but using functional genomics, we will be able to assess where physiological divergence begins.
So where physiological signs start. The signs in the
where
fish.
the signs of divergence among fish in different years, where do we begin to see those signs?
Right.
Because that is one of the points of the program. If we can identify physiological states that may undermine performance, one of the questions in the program is, where do we begin to see those signs? Is it emanating out of the freshwater environment, or do we not see those signs until fish hit the marine environment?
Sorry, I'm sorry I'm using up more than my time, but I'm not clear enough with my question, and so I'm just going to try it one more time, Dr. Miller, and be patient with me if you may. But what I'm trying to understand is, we don't know where the fish are at this point in time, where they're contacting this, if they're contacting it. All we know is where the physiological signs might start.
Oh, if you're talking exclusively of the MRS, the mortality-related signature, I was talking in more general terms of all aspects of physiology.
But this is what you're talking about here in NW, aren't you? You're talking about the MRS.
I was talking about overall physiological divergence, and the MRS is one component of the physiological divergence that we observe.
All right, I really do need to sit down. I've done my best to try to kind of clear this up.
I have Ms. Robertson for 5 minutes.
Krista Robertson for the Muscamazzoni Tribal Council. Dr. Miller and Dr. Garver, just so you know, the Muscamazzoni Tribal Council represents over 2,000 First Nations members who reside in the Broughton Archipelago. I just have a very few questions for you. Mr. Lunn, if you could pull up tab 10 of the aquaculture list of documents. Dr. Miller, do you recognize this document?
Yes.
So So is this your proposal?
This again is something that we were asked to put together by Mark Saunders, the head of the SAFE division, in a variety of different research areas. If we were to move forward with trying to determine whether or not specific hypotheses could be factors in these declines, what's the research that we need to move forward? That was the question that we were asked. We were all asked to put in general proposals. There wasn't a pot of money that we were putting these proposals into, but this was for the department so that they had on record what research the scientists believed needed to be done. And so yes, I wrote this in response to that.
Thank you. And if we could go to the second page of the document and highlight section 3B.
And as Mr. Lund does that, I'll just put on record, this is Exhibit 639. It's already in as an exhibit.
It's already exhibit 639? Okay. I won't mark it then. So if we could just look at, Dr. Mill, if you could look at 3B. What you're doing there is you're proposing a budget of $18,750 to test whether or not Atlantic salmon carry the signature. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And now, was that funding denied at that time?
As I said, there wasn't a pot of money available. This was the department asking the scientists to put in what work they believe need to be done to further validate or refute some of the hypotheses that were put forward. And I don't believe that the department has ever obtained any pot of money to work on sockeye salmon from the Fraser River during this inquiry. There has been small amounts of money that I have obtained, and I think Mark Saunders, the division head of SAFE, has really been a fantastic supporter of my program and where he's been able to find money, especially trying to go after the identification of a virus associated with this signature. He has obtained some departmental funds. So I have obtained some funding, not specific funding for this element.
Mr. Lund, if you could bring up exhibit 1526, please. So this is an email from Dr. Stewart to Dr. Garver, and it's the email is asking Dr. Garver to make comments on a briefing note for Dr. Laura Richards in preparation for her testimony for this commission just a few days later. Is that correct, Dr. Garver?
That looks correct.
And if we could go to the last page of that document, Mr. Lund. And if you could please highlight the second to last paragraph there. It says, in a meeting last week, Dr. Miller informed us she had obtained paravirus sequences from livers of fish showing this genomic signature. This type of virus hasn't been previously reported from fish, but it is known from other lower vertebrates. It says, in attendance was Dr. Brian Riddell, as well as representatives from the BCSGA. I think that should probably read the BCSFA. That'd be, do you agree with that? That'd be a typo, the BC Salmon Farmers Association and Marine Harvest?
I would assume so, yes. I should point out, though, that I wasn't at this meeting.
Dr. Miller, you were at that meeting.
Yes, Yes, I was.
I just want to ask about this because I frankly find it astounding that industry representatives, a stakeholder group, would be present at a briefing meeting between DFO scientists and DFO management. Were there any other interest groups present at that meeting, as far as you were aware?
They were not introduced to me, and I don't know who these people were that attended the meeting, or I don't know them to see them. So this was a meeting. There was quite a few people in the meeting around the table. There wasn't a round table that I recall where everyone said who they were and where they were from. Brian Riddle was there. I know Brian Riddle. He used to be my boss, and he's from the Pacific Salmon Foundation. And they have been working collaboratively on the PAR project as well, in providing some of the funding for the boats. Again, as I've said before, I was actually unaware that the aquaculture industry individuals were at this meeting. But I mean, we were all asked to provide an update as to where our research that potentially pertains to the PAR program was going, what our newest findings were. My program is really parallel to the PAR program. I don't obtain any direct funds from the PAR program. I do obtain samples from them. And so I was asked by my manager, Mark Saunders, to present some of the new data that we had.
And just one last question then. Dr. Miller, what, if any, trends are you seeing in your research on the signature in 2010 and 2011? Are you in a position to speak to that?
Very high.
Thank you. Those are my questions.
I have Ms. Shabas at 5 minutes now.
Mr. Commissioner, Nicole Chavez, co-counsel for Stolo Tribal Council and Giam Indian Band. And just a very quick follow-up question on the penultimate question of my learned friend. When talking about that PAR meeting, you did not see or recognize any First Nations leaders in the room?
No, I did not.
And you're not aware of any of them having been present at the meeting? Or informed about this?
No, I mean, I was simply someone who was asked to come to the meeting. I wasn't someone who was setting up the meeting.
Now, Dr. Miller, you started your genomics research into the en route mortality of Fraser River sockeye salmon in 2004-2005.
We got the instrumentation for the lab in 2004, but we didn't really do any studies until 2005.
But you were looking for your funding already. You were putting your proposals
Absolutely,
out
yes.
at that time. Now, and one of the things that you were responding to was the stated need or problem by high-level fisheries managers with the problem with predictability due to in-river mortality of fish, right?
Correct.
And so the problem with being able to predict that and also make associated management decisions, right?
Correct.
When we're talking about that problem, the Pacific Salmon Commission Fraser River panel refers to it as the difference between estimate issue, right?
Yes.
So, and that refers actually to what you're referring to as en route mortality of the fish, right?
Yes, that's highly variable between years.
Okay. Now, by 2004, we had actually been looking at over a decade of declining productivity of Fraser River sockeye salmon stocks since the early 1990s and increased en route mortality, right?
Yes, and my colleagues at UBC, Scott Hinch and Tony Farrell, had been working on this previous to my joining.
They were working on physiology.
They were working on physiology. They were, and David Patterson was also doing work in the river on physiology.
But by 2004, it was clear that there was greater en route mortality than the models were actually taken into account.
Yes, that was the issue.
Forecasting. The Department of Fisheries and Oceans and the Pacific Salmon Commission actually supported your genomic research starting in 2004-2005.
Yes, they did.
And they were looking at and supporting functional genomics as as a way of looking at overall fish health to help better predict en route mortality and get to the bottom of this issue.
Yeah, the amount of money I would have obtained in that year was sort of a proof of concept that this technology would provide useful information. In 2006 and 2007 were the years that we actually had a fairly decent amount of funding in a large collaborative, I think $1.1 million project. It was only a very small portion to me.
Where you could actually do some sampling, but you were quite innovative or resourceful in actually getting your hand on samples before then and drawing from other programs like the radio tagging program and the studies that were done on physiology in river to actually accumulate more data.
I was, because there was already a program with David Patterson from DFO and Scott Hinch and Tony Farrell, and so they very generously provided me samples before I was really involved with them.
So it's giving you a head start and also an opportunity to further test your hypothesis, right?
Yes, I mean I didn't. So you know, I've run experiments on 2003 fish, but not in 2003. You know, so yes, I was able to get backlog samples from fish that I could then analyze.
Now, you heard from what I'm going to dub the first disease panel that they were calling for a broader approach to looking at overall fish health that takes into account environmental conditions, presence of pathogens, the interaction, all the variable factors we've been talking about, right?
And I completely agree with that.
And I actually suggest that's what you're doing for your multidisciplinary research.
Yes, it is.
And based on your research to date, you would agree that we are looking at a major fish health issue that can help explain the high levels of onward mortality, right?
It is my opinion that we may be looking at a major fish health issue that includes fish health in response to environmental change.
Of course, that's why I was framing
Exactly.
it that way. Now, your research can help us actually better understand those causes for onward mortality, right?
I think that it will, yes.
And it can also assist with better management decisions.
We are in the process of taking some of the genomic data that we have and putting it into models. And so that is our intent, is to provide information to managers that will increase the precision of their escapement estimates.
And it's fair to say that we are looking at cutting-edge research that's multidisciplinary, has room for further involvement and inclusion of indigenous knowledge, and also currently has multiple funding sources.
Yes, and I stated that before, absolutely, yes.
I'd like Mr. Land to bring up Exhibit 1517. It's going to be my last question, and take you to the very last page, and the very last paragraph, actually. The very last paragraph of Exhibit 1517. And Dr. Miller, you'll see it in a second. Probably, it says it on the top, and if necessary, we'll take you to the first page, but I take it you recognize it as the timeline that you actually have developed at the request of Dr. Richards regarding your research and your outcome, right?
Yes.
And it takes us basically to where we are at today.
Yes.
And so taking you to the very last paragraph and basically the very last sentence, you're stating a very serious issue that your program currently is in severe jeopardy. And I'm going to ask you to comment on two things that are raised in those two paragraphs, namely, you're speaking about the funding of the Genomic Research Development Initiative through DFO, and you currently, I'm just going to ask you to comment on two things. Do you have a commitment for funding of GRDI from DFO now? And the other is the issue of accessing external funding, including Pacific Salmon Commission funding through contribution agreements, and whether that issue has been resolved.
I do not currently have GRDI money, nor does anyone else in the department, because the Treasury Board submission has not been passed. And the issue with using what we call SPA money, or external funds, to fund indeterminate staff has not been resolved. And therefore, I am very uncertain about how we will move forward as a group, because we have 11 indeterminate staff that we have for a number of years been paying with external funds, largely some of them through the Pacific Salmon Commission for our Stock ID program. And our Stock ID program provides real-time, in-season information about stocks that are used to open and close fisheries. That funding model that we have been using to fund that whole program is now absolutely in jeopardy, because we do not have a way to pay the technical staff.
Thank you. Those are all my questions.
Thank you very much. My name is Don Rosenblum, and I appear on behalf of Area D Gillnet, Area B Sainer. I first want to take this opportunity to compliment both of you as scientists for your contribution to the body of science that hopefully will lead to a more sustainable resource. Appreciating that my clients are commercial fishermen, they very much appreciate your work. I regret to have to raise with you, however, that last night certain matters came to my attention that I wish to raise with you in particular, Dr. Miller. And in raising these matters with you, I want to make very, very clear that in no way do I want my remarks to be interpreted to any way speak to the integrity of either your science or the integrity of the testimony you've given over these 2 days, and I want that very clear. However, a matter came to my attention yesterday, last evening, which led me to inform both the Commission this morning before the inquiry and indeed Counsel for the Department of Justice that I would be raising this matter. The information that's come to my attention is, and I don't want to be adversarial with you, and I want to sort of lead it out and make it as quick as possible, and hopefully you'll agree with me that your husband indeed plays a role in the aquaculture industry here in British Columbia. In particular, I'm focused on a company called Island Scallops Limited, and that your husband heads that company. Is that not correct?
Yes, shellfish culture, yes.
Yes. And this company, as I have done my research, is a company that is in the field of aquaculture, both in terms of scallop, in terms of many other species of shellfish, and in terms of finfish, in particular sablefish. Is that not correct?
They did some work in sablefish a number of years ago, but they're not in sablefish culture at the present time. It's all about shellfish.
And it is my information that, for example, when one researches the company, it's sometimes referred to as the largest private marine research hatchery and the first fully integrated shellfish producer in Canada. That'd be pretty accurate, wouldn't it?
It's no longer private.
Okay. Other than that, you would agree with me? It's one of the largest in Canada?
I don't know that, but it's very large, yes.
Fair enough. Thank you very much. And it's further my information in terms of the investigation that we've conducted between last evening and today, that this company, Island Scallops Ltd., which is out of Qualicum Beach on the island, is indeed a subsidiary of a parent company, and that back in the year 2007, that period approximately, the parent company was Edgewater Foods International. You're familiar with that company name?
Yes, I am. That was out of the U.S.
And it's, yes, indeed, registered out of Nevada, correct?
Correct.
And from our research out of Nevada, is it not also correct that at least in that period of time, in 2007, you were an employee of that company?
No, I have not been an employee of that company. I have never obtained any financial contribution from that company. We have done a little bit of genetic work to look for any indications of inbreeding in their scallops to make sure that they weren't inducing negative consequences to the fitness of the scallops that were in their program.
Would it surprise you if I told you that the registration of that company refers to you as chief scientific advisor?
But it's not a paid position. This is just I was providing advice, genetic advice about scallops.
But Dr. Miller, you aren't surprised to hear that the company held you up back in 2007 as chief scientific advisor.
Yes, and that's fully disclosed to DFO. I mean that there's nothing under the carpet about that. That is in full knowledge of
Fair
DFO.
enough. I don't want anything that our exchanges to be suggesting that in any way you have misconducted yourself. I want to make that very clear. Now let's go on from 2007. The parent company for Island Scallops is now a company called Ocean Smart Incorporated out of Maryland. Is that not correct?
Yes, I mean yes, that is correct.
And you wouldn't be surprised if that company also holds you out as the chief scientific advisor?
I actually don't know that they do.
All right, but you do scientific advisory work for them, don't you?
I have done work on the genetics of the scallops, and we are working with 6 different industry partners right now on the effects of ocean acidification on marine shellfish. And their company is one of the 6 companies that's involved in that program. I have a postdoc leading that program.
And your expertise obviously would be of great assistance to that company, obviously.
I have, through my career, done research for a variety of different purposes, mostly genetics research. Our lab has done a lot of the genetic profiling for the aquaculture, for the salmon aquaculture industry as well.
Yes.
As a DFO scientist, we do work for a variety of different stakeholder groups.
That's fair enough, but I'm trying to bring this to a more personal level. This is your husband's company that you are providing this scientific advice to, is it not?
My lab is providing scientific advice at the present time to 6 companies, and his being one of them.
Yes, And it would surprise you to know that when one does research Ocean Smart Incorporated out of Maryland, that you are referred to as a, quote, significant employee, unquote.
I was unaware. I'm not actually an employee, so I would be surprised by that.
Sure, yes. You have never received any income from either of three companies, Island Scalps Limited, Edgewater Foods, or Ocean Smart Incorporated?
That is correct.
And I assume from that you are not a shareholder of any of those three?
No, I'm not.
Thank you. But your husband is, obviously.
Yes, he is.
And he is a major shareholder of those companies, or those companies when they were active.
Yes, he is.
And the current active parent company is Ocean Smart Incorporated.
Yes.
And you agree with me that clearly this company's entire foundation of enterprise is aquaculture.
Shellfish culture, yes.
Yes. But the company also gives advice, does it not, in the sablefish industry in terms of farming?
They did a couple years of proof of concept work on sablefish. They were never a fully fledged sablefish production company.
But your husband has given advice in that, to that industry, hasn't he?
I don't believe he does provide any further advice when it comes to marine fish.
Further advice from what? I'm sorry.
Well, I mean, they worked on that, I don't know, 7 years ago or something. They were one of the first companies that tried to get that the sablefish culture up and running in BC. But it's a very expensive enterprise, as many individuals might know, and they decided not to continue pursuing it and to stick to shellfish.
I see. Finally, on this topic, I simply felt that it was incumbent upon me to have all this on record, that it should have been stated at the commencement of your testimony, and so I'm doing it now to complete the record, and I thank you very much for your response to my questions. If I am given 2 or 3 more minutes, I'm given 3 minutes. We've talked a lot about funding, and as we listen to the testimony of both of you in respect to where we're at in the research and all these big questions that remain unanswered, and the work that you feel is in the public interest to be done to start connecting the numbers to make a lot of sense out of this and hopefully bring some positive results to the resource. We have had testimony given here throughout this inquiry of the shortage of funds. We have had the Deputy Minister, Claire Dansereau, speaking to 5% reduction dictated by Treasury Board and so on. Are either of you optimistic that in the next 3-4 years you are going to receive the kind of funding from DFO that you believe is necessary to take these next incremental steps with your research? First of all, Dr. Miller.
I object. Mr. Rosenblum can ask what they know about what they will have, as well as what they do have. But to ask, are they optimistic, is simply an exercise in speculation.
Do you have any confidence that you're going to receive this funding that you feel is necessary?
My objection went to that he's not asking what they know, he's asking what they want or could or might speculate or have optimism towards.
I think it's important for the record of this inquiry whether scientists who are testifying of work that they feel has to be done to take the next incremental steps of what's been before us, we should be aware of whether they feel there are ways and means where they will receive that kind of funding.
I was just going to suggest that.
What if you, Mike could be...
Oh, I apologize. I'm guilty, like so many of us on the microphone. I apologize, Mr. Rosenblum. What I was going to say, I thought where you were coming to now would be helpful to me. That's ways and means. In other words, there is a process that they've already testified to in place for receipt of funds. Perhaps you can just get them to let us know where they're at in that process, because there is a process in place that they've already mentioned.
Yes, indeed. And the answer to that is?
The process in terms of receipt of funds for the present time now, or are you talking well into the future?
No, I'm talking about now into the next year to 2 years. You've spoken about the fact you have no funding right now.
Right now, it's somewhat insecure. Until we have a solution towards how we're going to fund our staff, we have to come up with all of the money to fund 11 indeterminate staff out of DFO only money, and we've never done that before. We've always funded them largely through external funds from the Pacific Salmon Commission, Genome British Columbia, even First Nations, other stakeholder groups, and now we can no longer do that. And so we are told by upper management that there will be solutions, that our staff will be somehow covered, but I haven't heard any concrete plans on how that's going to take place. And so I have been approached by a number of groups to do other work using external funds, again, work that is within the mandate of DFO and carries on the work that we're doing here. But I really can't accept funding from these groups until I know how my staff are going to be covered. So I'm in an insecure place, and I'm not the only one affected. My group is not the only one affected. We just happen to have the most staff affected, potentially, of any single group. I am assuming that there will be some solution to the Pacific Salmon Commission issue, and that they may make an exception. I'm hoping that we can still work with the Pacific Salmon Commission so that we can provide the fisheries management device that they actually need to open and close fisheries. I do think that because I think that is important enough, that there will be some solution that will be let. That still leaves the genomics program very wide open.
It's a little troubling right now, isn't it?
It is troubling and it's stressful.
Thank you. Dr. Garber, do you have anything to say in respect to the funding situation?
So far during my science career, funding is a perpetual problem. It's very expensive to do research. There is often limited funds to seek money through. And so you always have to have research that is of interest to multiple agencies and multiple funding groups to get research dollars. And yeah, funding has always been a problem in my program, and I presume it will continue.
Thank you very much for both of you answering my questions.
Mr. Commissioner, there's re-examination first by Canada, then by Ms. Chan.
Let me start by addressing what Mr. Rosenblum decided that he felt the need to raise, Dr. Miller, with you. You alluded to this, I think, but I just want to be clear. With regard to the companies that he spoke of, Island Seafood, Edgewater, and Ocean Smart, have you made known to the Department of Fisheries and Oceans your husband's role in that and any connection that you have had as you've described?
Absolutely.
And have you been given clearance on all counts?
Yes, I have.
And so you fully disclosed, I take it?
I've fully disclosed, yes.
And they fully agreed?
Yes.
And are you aware that there's a formal disclosure and process? That is to say, it's not just a matter you had a chat with the manager, you made a formal disclosure, did you?
Yes, it was a few years back, but yes, there has been a formal disclosure.
All right, I think it's important to remove that cloud that was unfortunately put in place by Mr. Rosenblum. I want to turn to funding, if I may. Are you, either of you, familiar with the acronym ACRDP?
Yes, Aquaculture Research and Development Initiative Funds.
All right.
I'm aware of that as well.
All right. Whoever wants to go first, are either of you aware of a current initiative for funding from industry to do research with regard to aquaculture and impacts and so forth?
Yes, I mean, that has been one of the goals of that fund for a number of years. I don't know if something new.
All right. What does it do then? What does this fund do? What is it?
I don't know if you want to speak to that.
And do either of you benefit from it in your labs?
I have had a few ACRDP program fund grants, whatever you would like to call them. My understanding is, and the way I've always used it, is to approach a research question. A good example is some of the research investigations I was describing earlier with viral dispersion from a net pen site. You take a research question that you're interested in our case, understanding viral transmission in an aquatic environment, and it's also a concern, obviously, with the aquaculture industry. So you form a collaboration such that it's a mutual benefit to both parties, in this case DFO and the aquaculture, to get these answers out. And so the industry does put in a certain contribution, monetary contribution, and DFO puts in a certain contribution. And by doing that, you're able to obtain research funds that then allow you to answer a question regarding something of interest to all parties.
All right, thank you. And did you say that your lab has received some benefit in that regard?
Yeah, particularly the viral dispersion model that we're working on right now, that is funded through ACRDP and involves Marine Harvest Creek, Seafoods, and Mainstream Canada.
All right. What about your lab, Dr. Miller? Do you participate in that?
Yes, and especially this year, because I was told I needed to find internal departmental money. ACRDP is one of the programs where there is money available, and I can fund my staff. And so as a consequence and due to some of the needs that existed, I have two projects. One I've already disclosed is the Creative Salmon Project, using genomics to try to understand a jaundice disease syndrome that they're experiencing. And the second is looking at ocean acidification effects on shellfish in the Strait of Georgia.
All right. In terms of funding and your lab, Dr. Miller, the people that you spoke of, I think 11 in number, are they at work right now?
Yes, they are.
And salaries being paid, I take it?
Salaries being paid right now, yes.
And management's aware of this issue, are they?
Yes, salaries, we have a one-year reprieve from Pacific Salmon Commission funding, and we are able to pay salaries for this year using Pacific Salmon Commission funds.
All right. And I think you spoke some of this, but to be clear, management is taking steps to address this issue, as far as you know?
Yes, I believe that they are in discussions in Ottawa about it.
This is a department-wide issue, I take it?
It is a department-wide issue, but there is no other single lab that has more than one or two staff members that have this issue.
And I gather what this has to do with is there's a rule and there's now some facts that have come to light about funding sources, and a fix needs to be found. Is that really what it comes down to?
Yes, and this has been something that's been ongoing for about a year and a half.
Dr. Garver, you were asked some questions by Mr. McDade about whether you thought fit to take action when certain levels of information are given to you. Do you have a decision-making role in fisheries management?
I do not.
Dr. Miller, you spoke of the 2007 smolts that you have studied and found a signature in. Do you, from memory, have the number to mind? How many smolts were there that were studied in that year?
We only had available to us about 12 smolts that were sampled in leaving Chilco Lake, so in the freshwater environment, and 10 smolts from the Fraser River that were sampled in Hecate Strait around the end of June, about June 29th. And we also had 10 samples that were from West Coast Vancouver Island stocks that were sampled at that same location.
All right, thank you.
Mr. Commissioner, I note the time I have only 2 questions in re-examination. Yesterday, Dr. Miller, counsel for the province asked you if the presence of a partial parvovirus DNA sequence means that the full sequence is there, or is it that the partial DNA sequence could be there by chance? And I understand your answer was to say that the fact that the partial parvovirus DNA sequence was there would not be by chance. Just want to follow up on the first part of that question, which was, does the presence of a partial parvovirus sequence necessarily mean that the full sequence is also there. And because we have Dr. Garver here as a virologist, perhaps if I could ask you for your answer first, Dr. Garver, and then Dr. Miller, do you have a follow-up to that?
Partial sequence does not necessarily mean a full sequence. The identification of a partial sequence does not necessarily mean a full sequence is there. It depends on also, you can get some indication of how real it could be by alignments and the size of it. Typically, there, as Dr. Miller alluded to, there are endogenous viral sequences in our genomic material. We all have them. Typically, they're relatively short, and so those sequences don't equate to a full-length virus. So there is some indication if you have a larger sequence, even though it may not be full-length, you can hedge your bet that that's a full-length virus sequence. But no, a partial does not necessarily indicate a full-length.
From the answer you gave me, is it your bet that the full sequence is there?
As of now, there's 2,400 bases is what you have now.
A little over 2,200.
Yeah, I would hedge my bet that a full-length sequence could be obtained upon further going in and sequencing.
I'm going to move to my next question unless Dr. Miller.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that. If a virus is endogenous, which means that it is within the genome of the fish, it's in the DNA of the fish. And if it's in the DNA of the fish, it is in every cell in that fish. Every cell has the same component of DNA. We do not find this sequence in every tissue within a fish. We have never found it in DNA fin clips. We see it in specific tissues and only in specific individuals. And within individuals, we do not see it in every tissue. And so therefore, there is absolutely no evidence that this is endogenous. My second point is we actually have one primer set that does amplify a very short piece of this virus from RNA, which suggests that there is some level of transcription occurring of this sequence in salmon. This is something that we're working on some more. That would suggest when a virus is active. So this is a very, very early stages of that, but so far I do believe that the data are pointing to an active virus.
Okay. My second question is, today, Council for the First Nations Coalition asked you, Dr. Garver, what can we do in terms of controlling human activity along the migratory route? And I understood that your answer was to say that biosecurity would be helpful. And I just want to follow on that and ask you, what did you mean specifically in terms of biosecurity measures in that context?
Well, again, without the knowledge that the virus is there and whether it differs between different watersheds, it's a bit premature to implement management strategies. But you could control movement of fish from one watershed to another whether it's live fish or carcasses, and that would be something that the Introduction and Transfer Committee would be overseeing and monitoring and making sure that diseases aren't spread from watershed to watershed.
Mr. Commissioner, I believe that concludes the evidence for this panel. And noting the time, perhaps it's appropriate to adjourn to 2.
Yes, thank you very much, Ms. Chan, and thank you to Commission Council. I particularly want to thank Dr. Miller and Dr. Garver for attending at the Commission and for providing your evidence and for answering the questions of all Council. Thank you very much.
Hearing is now adjourned until 2 p.m.